All right, thank you guys for bearing with us while we dealt with a couple of unanticipated technical issues. We appreciate your being here on time, and we're sorry that we weren't. I did want to welcome you all to the Insights to Action, how context matters, how understanding social norms is imperative to addressing child marriage. I'm Rachel Clement, a policy advocate here at ICRW and co-chair of Girls Not Brides USA, the U.S. partnership to end child marriage globally. ICRW is very excited to continue our Insights to Action this month on this important topic. Insights to Action is a monthly dialogue where we take the latest in research and project implementation and look at the challenges and successes that we've seen in our work, lessons learned, and important calls to action. We bring in experts like we did today to talk about how we can take all of those insights learned and inform our efforts going forward to create meaningful social change. If you are following online today, whether you're here in person or via webinar, I have 3 hashtags for you to use. The first is ICRW Insights, and the second 2 are End Child Marriage and Lead 4 Girls. The 4 is the number 4. That'll just help us kind of all stay in communication as we move forward. And if you'd like to stay in the know about the Insights to Action series, please email comm, at icrw.org. Today we are talking about child marriage. Child marriage occurs in every country around the world and is not bound by any one religion or region. Every year, 15 million girls are married before they turn 18. That's 1 girl every 2 seconds. For a girl, the start of her marriage often means the end of her education, greatly reduced income earning potential for the rest of her life, and an increased likelihood of getting pregnant and giving birth earlier and more frequently. She's also more likely to experience intimate partner violence, contract HIV, and could also be more socially isolated than her peers who do not marry as young. Child marriage, first and foremost, is a human rights violation that is firmly rooted in gender inequality. What works at the community level to end child marriage varies greatly by context. Local factors play an enormous role in which policies and programs work to end child marriage and address the needs of already married girls. And that's why we're focusing our attention there today. I am beyond thrilled to introduce Dr. Margaret Green, who we'd like to thank for both facilitating this conversation and sponsoring the discussion today. I have to read all of this from my note card because she is so impressive that I couldn't get it all down in memory. She's worked for over 20 years on the social and cultural determinants of health, development, policy, and gender. She's widely respected for her research and advocacy on the challenges faced by adolescents and women in a range of contexts, and works also on engaging men and boys for gender equality. She leads Greenworks, a consulting group working to promote social change for health and development, is on the board of Pro Mundo US, coordinates Child Marriage Research Network, and is just all around an amazing person. So without any further ado, I would like to thank Meg Green and everyone who's joined online.
After 20 years of professional experience, I still ask myself, when will I stop blushing? Very much for that warm introduction. I'm so happy to be here. The topic of child marriage is one that I've worked on for quite a few years, and in fact, starting before I came to ICRW and then when I was here and subsequently, and it's wonderful to see many ICRW colleagues here today, as well as other friends. What I wanted to highlight just as a tiny sort of warm-up to this session is the way that when we think about child marriage, there's so many commonalities that run across different settings. Things like the fear of sexual violence, poverty and strategies for household economic response, patriarchy, the control of girls' sexuality, religion. So these are threads that run across different settings where child marriage is more or less common, but they are features that shape the lives of girls in many settings. What we're trying to look at today, those features are there, but what we're trying to look at today is the more fine-grained understanding of the informal rules that govern behavior and preferences, and that basically bring social hierarchies to lives to life in the lives of girls and their families and communities. And to that end, today we have some speakers who are going to share with us some very interesting research that they've been conducting. First, we'll have Dr. Estela Rivero from the Mexican Institute Investigación en Salud y Demografía. She's a social demographer who specializes in the formulation and implementation of research studies that are meant to improve social interventions and programs. She has a PhD in demography and public affairs from Princeton University and more than 15 years of experience in working on gender, youth, education, sexual and reproductive health, and time use. What I thought I would do is, in fact, introduce all of the speakers first, and then we'll let them speak. Sadly, our second speaker, Emma Puig de la Bella Casa, is quite ill and was not able to join us. I'll be able to tell you a little bit about the multi-country study that she would have been sharing with you. And we'll also be able to ask questions of her Plan International colleague, Marcia Odell, who's come today and has kindly agreed to respond to any questions that we have. In addition, we are going to be hearing from Dr. Laura Hinson, who is a social and behavioral scientist here at ICRW. Dr. Hinson works to identify and reduce social barriers to sexual and reproductive health for men, women, adolescents, and other marginalized populations. She's currently leading ICRW's evaluation of a child marriage intervention in Malawi. She focuses in particular on understanding and measuring adolescent agency and positive youth development, as well as reproductive empowerment. And she's also leading ICRW's work on developing global measures of technology facilitated understandings of responses to gender-based violence. She has a PhD from the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health and an MPH from the University of North Carolina Gillings School of Global Public Health. And our last speaker is Mara Steinhaus, also from ICRW. She's a research and evaluation specialist, and she supports teams across the organization to design research protocols and tools and analyze and disseminate qualitative and quantitative data across a range of issues affecting women and girls. Currently, she's focusing on a project that includes an evaluation of a child marriage prevention intervention in Malawi, and that we will be hearing about, and an evaluation of an intervention to improve adolescent girls' access to long-acting reversible contraceptives in Kenya. And she has a master's in public health in international health from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And her background was in, oh, what a combination, computational mathematics and anthropology. That's a dream. So, thank you all again so much for being here. And Estela, would you please start us off?
Do I work with this?
Just a second.
Well, I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about this project that started 3 years ago. And since then, I've only slightly come to understand the relevance of early unions in Mexico, the diversity of it, and what challenges this represents for young women. Now, before I start, I want to say something about early unions. Why do I talk about early unions and not child marriage? And usually, child marriage is defined as the union where either one of the partners is younger than 18, and by that we mean formal or informal unions. But I prefer to use early unions because, as you will see, of the dominance of non-formalized unions in the case of Mexico. And I don't want to be giving the impression of most unions being marriages. So I specifically want to emphasize that. Now, I also think it's important that I mention that most of my research focuses on early unions where it is the woman who's younger than 18, because that's the most predominant case, and because the consequences for women when they marry early are more stringent than in those cases where it is men who marry early. And okay. A little bit about our study. The results I will be presenting are coming from an exploratory study, in Mexico funded by the Ford Foundation. It's a mixed methods study where we use the intercensus survey to explore the predominance and some of the characteristics of early unions in Mexico, both at the national, state, and regional level, and what the association is with other variables. We also conducted in-depth interviews with 17 women who entered the union before age 18 in 4 countries, in 4 states in the country where early unions are very high. We interviewed women in both rural and urban settings, and with key informants in 6 states, including the 4 states where we interviewed women. Our study is in no ways did not focus on social norms, but we actually found out that both in our interviews and in the diversity we found in our findings, social norms are important, or if not key, for understanding both the variation across the country and why it happens. So before I go into the social norms story, I want to tell you a little bit about what we found in terms of context. UNFPA's report to Jump to Marry in 2000 stated that in 2009, 23% of women 20 to 24 in Mexico have married before or entered the union before being 18. Our study finds that 6 years later, the phenomena is still very important in the country. We did not use the same indicators commonly used for child marriage studies because of data limitations. We wanted to go to the intrastate level, and in order to do that, we could only use intercensus data, which allows us to see what's the percentage of women 12 to 17 who are currently in the union as declared by them, or who have ever been in the union. Now, it's very important to understand that these might underestimate the prevalence of early unions because we are actually dealing with women who are still in the ages they might transition to an early union. What we found is that 1 in every 10 women aged 15 to 17 had been in an early union, and that 82% of those unions are non-formal. By non-formal, we mean many different things, but basically that they have not been married either by law or by religion. We also found that women in early unions were more likely to exhibit certain vulnerabilities than those who have never been in a union. Among those are dropping out of school, for example. For example, is there some way I can talk? Oh, now I turn this off. Adding to the technical difficulties of today's session. So actually what we found, for example, 90% of women in the union had dropped out of school versus only 15% of those who have never been in a union. And there's also a very important correlation with those who have with teenage pregnancy. Almost half of women who had been in a union had at least one live birth, whereas among those who had never been in a union, this is only 1%. So I think the message I want you to take from this is there is no single profile of early union in the country. And to add to that complexity, I'm showing you now the variation of the types of union, whether they are formal or non-formal, and the age difference with the partner for those who are very young, that is 12 to 14 and have ever been in a union. And we can see two things. One is that we have cases across the whole spectrum. Two, that non-formalized unions are what are more frequent. And three, that most girls in these cases are married or in a union with men who are at least 10 years older than they are. This is exactly the same, but now for older women, those who are 15 to 17, and the results are very similar. If anything, we find more variation across those who are older. We have more diversity in the ages of their partners, even when most are still in a union with an older man, but the pattern is basically the same. Now, that's individual heterogeneity. But our regional analysis also showed us that there's very important variation across regions in the country. What I'm showing you here is on the horizontal axis, three categories of the percentage of women 12 to 17 who are currently in a union. And on the vertical axis, three categories from low to very predominant of informal unions in the country. What do I want you to take from this? First, that there are regions throughout the whole categories. These numbers in each cell represent the number of regions that we found in each quadrant. The second thing I want you to take is that the poorest regions in poorest states tend to have more women who are in the union and also tend to have more informal or have a higher predominance of unions that are non-formalized. But I also want you to notice that that's not a unique pattern. So let's take Chiapas, for example, which is the poorest country in the state. We have regions in Chiapas where we have very high percentage of women who are currently in a union, but also diversity in how predominant formalized and non-formalized unions are. But we also find some regions in Chiapas where child marriage is not, where early unions are not very common. And the same thing happens with Chihuahua, which is a very rich state. We have regions in Chihuahua where early unions are not very common, but also some regions where it is very common. So we not only find heterogeneity within individuals, we also find clusters and heterogeneity across regions. My argument in this presentation is that social norms help us to understand why early unions happen in the country, the characteristics that they might have in different places, and why we have, or the consequences they might have. By social norms, I understand a rule of behavior that individuals conform to or decide to conform on the belief that most people in the relevant network are conforming to that behavior, and that they are expected to behave that way. Now, how does that affect child or early unions? Well, on the one hand, we state that they might affect the options that people believe they have given their situation, the consequences of the options they might have given others' perceptions, and their implications. But also, they norm socially what is expected from individuals at different stages in life. And they determine, and this is very important in Mexico, what's considered an individual in different life stages. What's a child, what's a teenager, what's an adult, and that's very important. So in our in-depth interviews, we found 3 different types of social norms that are affecting or are behind early unions. On the one hand, we found norms that are related to women's sexuality, and in particular to young women's sexuality, and over the perceived conception that only, there I went again, that only women who are in a union are legally allowed to be sexually active. That affects these actors at different levels. On the one hand, we have the societal perception of what's expected at different stages or what's expected to happen at different moments. Specifically, one thing that's very perceived is that pregnancy should be occurring within a union. Because pregnancies make it evident that women are sexually active, and any distortion of that is actually a distortion of the normative life course in Mexico. Now, within that overall framework, we have norms that affect individuals when they are in non-normative. For example, parents of women who are in, or especially young women who get pregnant before entering a union, are in the are norm to repair the honor of their daughters. Within the same general norm, women are expected to experiment with sexuality only when they are in a formal union, and in many cases, that's one of the reasons why they enter a union. And in the same sense, men are expected to get married or in a union with a woman who's not sexually active, because they are made to believe that women who are sexually active are not going to be as, they are going to be not as trusted as others. The second set of norms is the perception of adulthood and status, what actually gives women, men and women status in a society. The first subnorm in this sense is what individuals are available to do at different stages. So for example, it is believed that agency and the power to make decisions and independence is restricted to adults. Now, what is an adult is, in the case of women in many communities, defined by finding a partner, getting into a union, and having a child in that order. But most determinant of that all is being in a union. And that actually links to the status of a woman in many communities, especially indigenous communities. So women are granted a recognition in the community only when they become someone's wife. And by wife, we mean in the end. The third set of norms that we found to be relevant is what we call romantic expectations. And by these, we mean, first, that women are expected to be able to conquer men and to get men to engage or commit to them. And that commitment actually is represented through men's demand for women to move in with them or elope. And because that is what women are expecting, and that's what they are trained to achieve, once they are in a situation where they are starting a romantic relationship and their boyfriend or partner asks them to move in with them, they believe that they should respond positively to that request. Now, in our case, these three general sets of norms are behind most of the explanations we found for very different cases. So we've interviewed women who entered the union because they were pregnant, some because they were in a romantic relationship and their boyfriend pressured them to spend the night out and have sex, or in some communities because they started a romantic relationship and what was expected from them was to move in with their partner very soon afterwards. The point here is that in all those cases, no matter how different they seem, there's always a perceived role for them to play and an explanation in terms of what society expects from them. So for example, in the case of women who were pregnant, they moved in because they needed to repair the pregnancy. In the case where women spent the night out, they just couldn't face the shame of being out tonight and being recognized and being sexually active outside of a union. And in the case of those who move in, even when not sexually active with their partner, they were responding to their romantic expectations and to the idea that once they become someone's wife, they would be someone in their community, they would be granted a status. So, in some, I hope I was able to transmit you that early unions are still very common in Mexico. There's a great variety of both the conditions and the characteristics they have throughout the country. They have also that they happen in very different contexts. And there's a social norms playing at different stages of the process, both determining who's able to get sex, when they are supposed to be getting sex, and what might happen in the case that they step out of a regulated norm. And we also think that it's very important to recognize these in terms of defining any policies or interventions that either try to decrease early unions or to decrease their consequences. First, we need to have interventions that are evidence-based, but also that they consider the variety of social norms that are intervening in the phenomenon in Mexico and the step they are intervening on. And we need to work more on understanding that. That's really key for having good interventions. And with that, I leave you with my contact information. We brought some reports, which there are executive summaries outside and full reports for those of you who are interested in the study. And if not, you can always access the report here. And that's it. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Estela. I have one clarifying question. In the survey, were both men and women surveyed, or was it a survey of women?
It's both men and women.
Does anyone else have a clarifying question? We'll have the chance to discuss things in greater depth later. Great. I love the charts that you did, sort of breaking down the social norms, and I hope that we can have more of a discussion about those later. When you were discussing the age difference between men and the girls who get married to them, it reminded me of some research that I conducted some years ago with an economist on looking at demographic data to understand the marriage market. And what we found was that there were bigger age differences in consensual unions in Brazil. That's where we were doing this analysis. And what we hypothesized was that it was easier for men to marry younger women, and they could leave and go to other marriages. So there was this sort of, because of the age pyramid, more women, fewer men, and the women willing to settle for informal unions, which are very disadvantageous to them, because otherwise they might not get into unions at all. So, a sort of population dynamic that then plays out in the relationship. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, Emma is not able to join us today, but I'm able to say just a few words about some of the themes that she might have touched on, in part because I'm the research director for the multi-country study in Latin America that Emma would have told you more about. I think the things that we particularly wanted to highlight about child marriage in Latin America is that child early and forced marriage is yet to be recognized as much of a social issue. People do not recognize it the way that we in this room recognize it. And one of the challenges is this vocabulary issue. Is it a marriage? Is it a union? And then there's so many variants on the different terms for describing these relationships, and it just makes it harder to sort of zero in on what the problem is, and these unions are invisible when data are collected, often in surveys and so on. In response to that challenge, Plan International's regional office is conducting a multi-country study in 8 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, in Brazil, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Peru, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic, with Ecuador and Haiti likely to follow later. And the detail that I wanted to highlight about this multi-country study is that all of the country research teams came together and agreed on a shared methodology, which uses CARE's SNAP methodology. If some of you are familiar with it, it's a system of using vignettes and then recording people's reactions. So these two people do act like this. What do you think she should do? What do you think he should do? And so on, and really capturing people's normative sense of what the appropriate behavior is. We are finding that, as Estela highlighted, that child marriage is expressed very distinctively in indigenous, Afro-descendant, and European origin populations in the region. And so it's really important, if you want to understand child marriage and particularly the normative context, to be looking at a lot of different subgroups living in different places of different socioeconomic levels and so on, to really understand motivations. One of the features of child marriage in this region that doesn't come up perhaps quite as much in some other places is how sexual violence among minors is related to child marriage in the region. And then also a theme that Estella touched on, that the actual desire for sex and for sexual relationships and the choice by girls to enter these, what basically they're compelled to enter unions because it's the only, at least semi-legitimate way in which they can have sexual relations, and so it pushes them in the direction of something that's more fixed, because it's the only condition under which they can have sex. And this challenge, I think, for us who are activists in sexual and reproductive health and rights is, if we are fighting against, if we wish to reduce child marriage or end child marriage, there's so much to be done to, if we wish simultaneously to support girls' sexual autonomy and decision-making and their desire, which is something that is impelling them into these unions. So it's just a very complex region in which to understand these issues. The initial findings are just emerging, and we hope to have a regional report out in the late spring. And now, let's hear about Malawi.
So I'm Laura, and as she mentioned in the introduction, I'm leading ICRW's work on the ENGAGE project, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of the project, and then I'll hand it over to Mara, who is the lead quantitative analysis on our work. So, oh, clicker. So ENGAGE, Enabling Girls to Advance Gender Equity. This project takes place in Malawi, which is ranked, I think, number 10 or 11th in terms of child marriage rates. Actually, marriage under the age of 18 has been illegal since 2015, but there's a lot of concern and a lot of evidence that suggests that locally they're not really paying attention to the national law, and girls are still getting married, so hence the need for this project. Our work is focused in southern Malawi, particularly in Palombe and Cholo districts. Southern Malawi has very high rates compared to the rest of the country. So the goal of the ENGAGE project, our dream scenario, would be a reduction in child marriage rates. But the program team, who is comprised of Rise Up, which is based in PHI in California, and the Girls Empowerment Network of Malawi, they are trying to do this by addressing gender norms, sexual and reproductive health issues, social norms, a bunch of other things through their programming. So there's 2 interventions that are part of ENGAGE. The first is a girls empowerment intervention. And in this intervention, they take a cohort of girls and they train them and teach them and empower them in all sorts of different things, including communication and advocacy skills, teach them about their rights that they have, sexual and reproductive health, importance of education, all of that good stuff. Then the idea is these girls go back out to their communities and they run girls clubs, and they do activities with parents or decision makers, and they talk to traditional leaders in their communities. And they talk about all these stuff, and they use the skills that they've been taught in this program to do all of that. The other intervention is a CSO, or civil society organization, capacity building program. So again, they bring together CSO leaders in these communities. They train them. These CSOs then develop an advocacy strategy, and they're given seed grants to go implement these strategies in the communities. So ICRW is the research partner. We are doing a mixed methods, quasi-experimental evaluation of this project. So in ARM, and it has 4 arms. So in ARM 1, girls intervention. In ARM 2, CSO intervention. In ARM 3, both of those. And then ARM 4 is our comparison arm. And this design is really set up to help the program staff understand, do we need that enabling environment around the girls to really reach our outcomes? Is it important to have those civil societies, people working, or can we just work with girls alone? Is girls alone enough? I didn't explain that very well, but I think you got it. So we just finished our quantitative survey this fall with 1,492 decision makers of girls ages 10 to 17. And we chose this as our study population because the idea is that through both of these interventions, they're really reaching the entire community. So we wanted to see, is there change going on at the community level based on these interventions? And the survey focused on classic child marriage norms, attitudes. Did they know about the national law? Did they know about local laws? Gender norms. What are decision makers' attitudes towards adolescent sexual reproductive health? What are their thoughts, opinions, girls' education? What do they think about harmful traditional practices, which is a whole other separate topic, but can include things like girls attending these sexual initiation camps at puberty. And then we also did a module on a particular reference girl that they chose to think about and learned about their decision making for that girl. Who decided how she went to school? Who decided when and if she'll get married? Who's part of that decision making process? So now I'm going to turn it over to Mara, who's just going to tell you all sorts of fun things about social norms.
All right, not all sorts of things, very few things. Very few things, given the time. Right, so as Laura previewed, I'm going to talk just about 3 of our social norms measures that were included in this baseline survey. They were directly based upon CARE's SNAP framework, which was mentioned earlier. Particularly, CARE has done work with their SNAP framework in several contexts and for several projects, but they did one project in Ethiopia specifically related to child marriage, and so that's the project upon which our measures were based. And for those of you that are familiar with the framework, this is just a piece of it, but these are the quantitative pieces that are critical to demonstrate the presence of a norm. So the 3 components that need to be present in order for us to confidently say that child marriage is a social norm are empirical expectations, normative expectations, and sanctions. So empirical expectations are what we think others are doing. Normative expectations are what we think others think we should do. So it's a double layer, what I'm thinking other people think I should do. And sanctions are the anticipated consequences of a particular behavior. And they can be positive or negative. So in this case, we were looking for the anticipated results of choosing to marry a daughter or niece early versus not. And what did we find? Jumping right to the findings. Is child marriage itself a social norm? We definitely found strong evidence of empirical expectations in these communities. Almost 9 in 10 of the adult decision makers that we interviewed agreed that most girls in their community married before the age of 18. So there's definitely that piece of the expectation that this is happening frequently in these communities. Things got a little bit stranger when we asked about normative expectations. So adult decision makers were asked whether or not they agreed that most people in the community expected girls to marry by the age of 18. So that's the difference, the expectation that others expect them to marry before the age of 18. And it was almost evenly split. So almost exactly the number of people that agreed that others expected girls to marry early, half also disagreed. So that gave us a little pause. And then when we asked about sanctions, we found our statement that they could agree or disagree with was, if I don't ensure my daughters or nieces are married early, my family will not be respected in my community. And we chose this particular sanction in consultation with our implementation partners. They felt that that was the most common consequence for families that chose not to have their daughters or nieces married young. However, just 1 in 3 adult decision makers agreed with this statement directly. So this wasn't what we anticipated. As Laura mentioned, we were the evaluation partner. We were brought in to this study that was designed based on understanding that child marriage itself was a social norm in these communities and was being driven by these social expectations. And so I want to assure you that we didn't just take this at face value. We did a lot of cross-checking with the other measures that we had included in our tool, particularly the attitudinal measures related to whether or not adults said that they personally also believed or did not believe that girls had a right to choose when to marry, to choose whom to marry, and many direct and indirect questions, and ultimately came to the conclusion that this is at least consistent with the other data that we collected at the same time. So, given that we have some confidence in these findings, how do we interpret them? So the first thing we did was look at prudential reasons, which is a theory term, but means alternative explanations for child marriage in the communities. Luckily, we had asked some questions, not a lot, but some questions about alternative reasons for child marriage in these communities, and people agreed and felt strongly that it may happen because of pregnancy, lack of education and job opportunities, financial reasons, and family disputes. So we do have some evidence that there may be other things also playing a role in perpetuating child marriage in these communities. And simultaneously, we also wanted to explore, okay, so maybe child marriage itself isn't a social norm. People don't expect girls to marry, and they won't say that openly, but they may have attitudes that are still indirectly leading to child marriage. And in particular, we saw a lot of evidence in the data that we collected that, consistent with Estella's finding in Mexico, that attitudes towards adolescent sexual and reproductive health and activity and access to contraceptives were very much not in the way that we would hope that they would be. So people agreed that unmarried girls who got pregnant were naughty. They agreed that giving unmarried girls access to contraceptives would make them promiscuous. And they also, the minority felt that they wanted unmarried girls to have access to contraception in their communities. We also included other measures developed for the Global Early Adolescence Study about two things: the appropriateness of adolescent sexual relationships as viewed by adults. Is it appropriate for girls to be engaging in sex before marriage? And whether or not there was a sexual double standard in these communities, and we did find evidence of that as well. So that's another interpretation of these findings. And so what are the implications? For programming, first of all, it's definitely appropriate to acknowledge and build upon the evident sensitization and opposition to child marriage that we discovered. It was greater than we had previously known it to be, but that's something that we can build upon, and it means that the program can start from that point of success. We can also increase knowledge of laws. So as Laura mentioned, child marriage is illegal. There's no exceptions. But not many people were specifically aware of the laws, and so it's possible that by increasing knowledge of the laws, that will be one more tool for people who are already advocating against child marriage in their community, another point of leverage for them. Luckily, as Laura mentioned, the leadership curriculum for the girls leaders included components of sexual and reproductive health and access to contraception as part of that training. So we would recommend that they emphasize that, given that that seems to be a critical point of intervention in these communities. And then additionally, the civil society organizations, which have not yet been selected or worked with, could be guided to consider not only the sexual and reproductive health and norms around that for adolescents, but also prudential reasons for child marriage that may exist. And then the implications for ourselves as the measurement folks. Definitely supplement quantitative research with qualitative vignettes. This was before we even had this finding, part of our plan for midline and endline. We just didn't have the funding to do it at baseline. So we're very much looking forward to that additional explanatory power and investigative process very soon. Always include measures of prudential reasons or alternative explanations. So this is part and parcel with being good scientists, but not only including measures of what we think is important or what we hope to find, but also what we may not expect to find, and alternative explanations that would help disprove our assumptions if that's going to make for a better program. And then this is beyond the scope of this evaluation. We won't be changing any of our methodology, but in the future, we want to consider additional methods, more advanced quantitative methods designed to limit social desirability responses, especially if we're going to be in communities that are already highly sensitized to the issue of child marriage, to avoid, to give even more credibility to our results. All right.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the panelists to come and sit here, and I have just a few questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and you may ask more questions. I have a kind of playful yet serious question for you that just occurred to me. I was thinking about how a person is supposed to cross their legs in front of a camera. And wondering whether, if I ask the question, how does Queen Elizabeth and members of the court, how do they cross their legs? Is that a normative expectation?
How others think you should.
But they're others of status.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it doesn't.
Depends on if they're a reference group.
Yeah,
Clearly they are.
If you care about their opinion and they say you should, then it's enough for myself too.
Very good. Well, thank you all so much for kind of touching on the issue of social norms from different interesting directions. I wanted to ask you first, obviously we purposefully highlighted social norms in this panel, but I wondered if you could say something about both of the settings in which you worked, about the factors that are playing in that play an important role that are other than social norms, the sort of, the other context in addition to social norms.
Well, in the case of Mexico, this is something that we really need to understand better. Our own research and what's been done in the past points to the usual suspects. Low income, low education or dropping out of school, pregnancy, in some communities and in some cases domestic violence. But there is the need to understand better two things, both the timing of the different events. I mean, we don't really know whether dropping out of school is directly related and a cause to an early union, and low income is again a cause or a consequence, and so we need to understand that better. The other thing, and by saying we need to understand better, it's not to diminish its importance, right? Girls who are in an early union are in worse conditions. But we also need to understand what's causing women or the heterogeneity within communities. Early unions are more likely to occur in indigenous communities, low income, not very developed, those communities that are far away. But that's at the community level. We need to understand how common it is within communities. We could only go to the regional level because of the data limitations, but something that's evident is that even when in some communities, early unions are very common, not all women are getting married before they turn 18. So that's the relationship, but we still need to understand what makes some women go into an early union and what not.
Right, the individual.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say about that in your context? Sort of the additional factors that are particularly important in Malawi other than social norms?
Yeah, and I just want to caveat for this that Mara and I are like the data dweebs, so we are not experts in child marriage in these communities, and our program staff, if they were here, could probably speak for 3 hours on this. So just that caveat. But just from my experience being in these communities, I mean, there was one thing that a school teacher said to me, which is just that these communities are extremely remote, extremely poor. There are just no opportunities. So I think we didn't ask enough questions about some of these provincial reasons, but I do think just a complete lack of any other opportunity. And she said something about, when the girl gets married, she gets a kanga, so she gets like a little piece of material that she can wear, and that's something. There's a visibility there that shows that she has a little bit of status. And we kind of saw a bit of this when we were working with our team doing data collection that indicated that a lot of the participants were actually saying, oh, but girls want to get married. Like they're the ones actually interested in getting married. So again, we have no quantitative evidence to this, but just hearing little things, we're kind of curious if like there is a bit of like peer pressure or just some sort of social, you know, standing with it. So something we want to follow up on in the qualitative midline.
Well, if I could ask the two of you another question, since you self-identified as data dweebs, I wondered if
And we
you
can
could say
put you in that category too.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you approach the measurement of social norms and how that might be different from how some other people do it.
Sure. So, you know, as I mentioned, our measures are directly based on CARES. So I think we did tweak them. So one way in which we changed CARES measures was that they had a much more technical question about sanctions related to child marriage. So I think it included like, actually I'm not going to say it. I don't remember it verbatim, but we had to really simplify that question. We felt that it would completely not be understood for what it was if we asked about it that way. So there was some modification in that sense. Did you have?
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking when at the beginning of this project, when we talked about what are the outcomes we're interested in sort of measuring and seeing change over time, we had a lot of discussion with the program staff and with the donor as well about what that could be. And I can't speak for all of the like history of the social norms measurement community. I know there are some social norms measurement folks here. Hello. Who maybe could say more, but I think people kind of thought they were measuring social norms, but they were really kind of getting at attitudes. So I think we spent a lot of time trying to think, what are norms and can we really measure it? And actually measuring norms is hard, and also seeing change in norms over time is really hard too. So that's not our main outcome of interest for this project because we were not convinced that we would actually see much movement on that over time, but we decided we still wanted to try these measures and kind of to see what happens. So I would just add that I think in the last 5 years, there's been a lot more effort into really figuring out what norms are and how to measure them more robustly.
Estella, could I ask you a question that relates to the kinds of things that our missing speaker might have said, which are, what do you think are some of the distinctively Latin American features of child marriage that you saw in Mexico?
Well, there are several, and you mentioned them, some of them really. I think in a way, Mexico is a good summary of what's happening in different Latin American countries. We have indigenous communities that are seem to be working, or early unions are very similar to what happens in countries that are predominantly indigenous, as Guatemala, with some indigenous rural areas in Honduras, where very much, I won't say that early unions are normative, but women are expected, given their options, to marry early or enter a union early. There are some cases, we didn't document them, but through the CSOs that we work with, there's evidence that there are still some exchange of girls for money. There's also, so that's in indigenous communities. There in courses in most Latin American countries, there's this regulation of female sexuality that takes different forms. One is if the women want to get, given where they are, they enter a union once they become involved romantically, because that's the only way they can experience sexuality. And there's also the section for teenage pregnancy, and which is more common in urban areas than in other countries. So I guess that also brings to the difference in the meanings of early unions in Mexico and in Latin America, and what it means both to the ways women enter a union and the way they experiment it, and what it means for them to be in a union.
I have one last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. I was wondering if you could say something about the value added that comes to us from focusing on social norms, because this is definitely a very, it's sort of, you know, I don't know, the sexy topic of the last few years, and I think it means a lot of different things to different people. What is it that it brings to a discussion of something like child marriage? What's the extra that it brings?
I'll start. I'm sure we all have thoughts. I think one thing, I think that what people identified when social norms became such a hot topic was that a lot of interventions, child marriage or otherwise, were not successful. We thought we understood what was happening, we provided whatever intervention, and it didn't work. And I think that social norms can be, in some circumstances, a missing piece that explains behavior that is otherwise not logical or consistent if we understand that people are choosing to behave in a certain way as a result of the expectations that they perceive of others for themselves. So I think it's kind of like an extra add-in. It's not a replacement for understanding other reasons child marriage happens, for example, but I think it has additional explanatory power that is very interesting and important to understand if you want your intervention to succeed. So that's one thing.
Well, in my case, I'd just say we did not focus on social norms at the beginning, but it has later helped us to understand heterogeneity in terms of why it happens in some cases and not in others. And so that's in terms of explaining early unions. Why some women, given their low education, the conditions they are living in, that there are no jobs for men, are getting, I'll say, married to be simple, and others in the same conditions are not. That's in terms what makes them abide to what's expected from them and what makes others not abide, or whether it's not expected from them. It also, I think, and this is something that we need to explore further, help us to understand the consequences of early unions. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important to think that it's not the same to be a girl who's married in a union in a community where no one else is married, and from what it is like to be in a union in a community where everyone else is. And that's to say that consequences and the social support that they may get in one case and the other are very different. And in the medium-term goal of trying to make girls they make informed decisions in the best conditions and then to decrease child marriage, we also need to think of what the impact of those and how to help those who are already in the union is. And social norms are determinant with that.
Right, so they're determining lots of conditions of girls and young women's lives, not just whether or not they're married.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say something sort of similar, but I was flipping and starting with like a whole Debbie Downer thing about social norms, because sometimes I'm just like, they're so messy, they're so hard to measure. And even once you know them, it's not like a automatic, immediate, programmatic recommendation from that. But I think sometimes I'm like, why am I not just doing like biomedical markers? These are like so much easier. But at the same time, I do feel like if we can crack that net and really figure out how to address them meaningfully, like you're saying, like we can cover so many more outcomes that we care about. I mean, I know the gender norms work, if that was kind of the idea. So gotta keep trying.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for these responses to my questions. And now I'd like to open it up to the floor. I'm sure there are many other questions in the audience. I see spring-loaded arm. Please. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Well, I am Karin from Kosovo. I work for the Pan American Health Organization in something a little bit different, household energy and household air. It has a lot to do with social norms and social perceptions. And I was interested in comment, but my question is that I am surprised to note that the violence is not like very present in the presentations and the idea of, because for me, I am from Mexico, and in my opinion, sometimes it's not like the girls get married or in a new, not because they want to, but it's not a consent. Sometimes it's, even in Mexico, it's very common to say the man, it's still that woman. It's not like you decided to do it, but your boyfriend or the man you are dating will decide one day to steal you, and then you are done because it's impossible for you to go back to your house, and you have to continue living with that man. And usually, and that's something that is interesting too. In many of the rural communities, when the men had a woman, they will go to live in their man's house. And then they become like at the service of the mother-in-law. Then it's like a very complex system that I think that needs to be taken into account when trying to explain what is going on. Because even to decide as a society that if you are pregnant you have to get married, that's a kind of violence, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like the nature of the relationship, when, we heard about the big age gaps, when girls marry younger, bigger age gap, less education, a whole lot of factors, presumably, less of a future commitment to employment and income and so on and so on. So many, many disadvantages that play out in a very unequal relationship and violence as part of that mix.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Alex. I work for a small federal agency here. I'm the director of gender and social inclusion, and I work on child marriage, but we don't work directly on sexual and reproductive health, which is frustrating because they're certainly, I think, and you said this today, that they are linked. And I work on Niger, which is doubly frustrating because there's highest birth rate in the world and highest rate of child marriage. And I think each one of you have touched on this phenomenon that's new to me, this dynamic where parents say, well, if she's hanging out with boys and she's 16, she needs to get married right now because unmarried pregnancy would bring shame on the family. And so that's where I think, the availability and even more importantly, the acceptance of contraception and abortion could have a huge impact on child marriage. And so I'm curious, has anybody tried to draw a straight line between access to contraception and child marriage? For example, maybe in Ethiopia, where, if I remember right, abortion laws were liberalized in the early 2000s, so you could do like a case control study almost, or in Mexico, where Mexico City's laws are much more liberal than the rest of the country. Maybe you could try to control for. Has anybody?
Did anyone hear that question?
Well, I'll try to answer briefly to those questions. I think violence is a very important point. We saw evidence of it and through many different ways. You're right, the stealing the girlfriend is one of them. The consequences of girls going to live in their in-laws is stringent. But we also found, and I think that's also been seen in other Latin American countries, that women are trying to escape violence within their households, and their only option is to get married or be in a union. And we need to understand the inequalities between the girls where they are going to and their partners, and how that affects their status afterwards. In terms of sexual and reproductive health, we have not done specific study, what's seen in Mexico is that municipalities with higher teenage pregnancy have also higher and unwanted and unmet demand, contraceptive demand, also have higher rates of child or early unions. So that needs to be explored further. But I think there are also very important consequences of what we are seeing in terms of the relationship between early unions and early pregnancies. As I showed, most of the women who got pregnant or have most of the teenage pregnancies end up or are preceded by an early union. It's very rare that afterwards women who are girls are not married and get pregnant. And this has very important consequences for the way that sexual and reproductive health programs for teenagers are planned. At least in the case of Mexico, the country has been worried a long time about teenage pregnancy, not as much about child marriage. And they are seen independently. And actually, most of the time and most programs conceive the need of teenage girls as they being single. But there's a very important group of girls who are in a union, and their needs are very different from those who are not in a union. So that needs to be considered as well.
Well, to respond directly to your question, I am not aware if anyone's done a quantitative analysis of Ethiopia as a case study. That's a cool idea.
Was it the early 2000s when they liberalized their abortion laws a little bit? And maternal mortality came down, right? I wonder if child marriage also.
ICRW has done previous work that has directly linked pregnancy and child marriage. Specifically, I'm thinking of a qualitative study that we did that was in Zambia and Kenya, where we just developed a conceptual framework for pathways to child marriage, and pregnancy was one of the main pathways. So certainly, qualitative work supports that. Some other thing I was thinking, but I've lost it.
Well, I mean, certainly our findings kind of suggest that link a little bit. So we wanted to and also for the violence, we had one measure about whether violence was a reason for getting married. No, you want to make that?
But violence measures certainly related to the harmful traditional practices. So we did ask about their attitudes towards the sexual initiation camps. So we'd be happy to talk more about that.
I had one response to that. I think, well, there's a group of organizations that are starting to try to think about sexuality, like the social construction of sexuality as it relates to sexual violence and coercion and child marriage and so on. And then I also think that the work that's happening in many places with men and boys and encouraging them to look at why it's such a core part of sexuality or an unquestioned part of sexuality to be dominant. And then how that plays out in the non-use of contraception and in coercion and so on and so on. That's not kind of an explicit link with child marriage, but I feel like there's an opportunity there to do more on the intervention side.
Yeah, my name is Laura Grogel, and I'm a Gender Integration Technical Advisor for Catholic Relief Services covering the Central Africa region. So my question is specifically about looking at the empirical normative expectations by subgroup. I wanted to give an example from, I'm a programmer. I'm not a researcher, just FYI. But in DRC, we did a gender analysis during one of our big program startups. And what we found, looking specifically at this issue of early marriage, was that the different subgroups had different attitudes about it. And particularly, this gave us an entry point for programming around engaging with young boys that had more progressive views around this area. And then on the inverse, our original programming approach was targeting grandmothers with the idea that they were these gatekeepers of this practice. And what we found through our formative research was that in fact grandmothers wanted nothing to do with this problem because of the risk associated with it. And so I wanted to ask if you did some subgroup kind of disaggregation, and then also just for any programming recommendations, just to push the implementers to do this type of research prior to implementation to understand the social norms. I know that seems simple, but we don't do it enough. And so whatever you do when you're doing your recommendations, just making that at the forefront of your recommendation. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yes, we definitely did do subgroup analyses. We also encountered this kind of misperception, perhaps, of who was making decisions for girls related to marriage. Prior to conducting this study, the information that we had, which was from people working in the communities, was the perception that a lot of marriage decisions were particularly influenced by uncles. And so in our decision making for the reference girl module, we asked them about decisions, and we asked about their relationship and the relationship of anyone who would be involved in the decision. And we anticipated finding that uncles would come out as this huge reference group related to these decisions, and they absolutely did not. If you ask men, it's fathers who are making these choices, and if you ask women, it's the mothers.
And part of their program was to go and have these uncle chats and work with the uncles, and you have to be like, maybe not do that so much.
We focused on someone else did data collection with uncles, which would have been a whole different waste. So we're glad we did it. But we definitely did also disaggregate the empirical and normative expectations a few different ways. Yeah, gender. They're all adults. I don't think we broke it out by age, but they're all. So definitely gender, definitely site. We looked for if different things were happening in different arms, perhaps, because that would be very important. And we didn't find statistically significant differences between the two.
I see several more questions and that we are short in time, so I'd like to ask, actually, I think it's 3 people who have questions. And then if you would please ask your questions in sequence, and then we'll open up to the panel to answer.
Great. Sure. My name is Nana Dagadu from the Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown University. Thanks for talking about the reference groups and sort of the slicing of your demographics. Really curious also, Estella, if you did that with I think you broke up your data by 12 to 14 and then 15 to 17. And if you did that as well in your research with the reference groups, and really would be interested in hearing if you also looked at the men's status. I think you talked a bit about the girls gaining this sort of elevated status in early unions. Would be interesting to see from the male perspective as well.
I'm Nanette Burke. I work for an NGO, but I'm really here in my capacity as an anthropologist. And I have a general question about what if we just replaced the word social norms with culture? Because I think that would resonate a lot with more anthropologists. They understand culture change, intra-cultural variation, and so the fact that not everybody within one country is going to act the same, DRC, certainly not can all be the same. But then I also have a specific question is about what about looking at positive deviance and girls in these communities that don't get married until they're 18, 20, 25, and figure out what they're doing, and then we'll use that for programming.
Did I see another hand over here? Maybe not.
There was one over there.
There was, okay, good.
Yes. I did have a question, thank you. I'm Lyric Thompson. I have the pleasure of working with these ladies at ICRW, but haven't had the pleasure of talking to them about this project yet. So this is delightful, and I'm very excited to be moderating Estella tomorrow morning at OAS, so welcome, and we're so glad to get a preview. 2 follow-up questions from my end. One of the most striking things that I heard you say, Stella, was the age spread actually being the highest number of unions being 10 plus years of difference in age, which is not our typical experience necessarily. So I was just interested in your thoughts, either stipulations or whether your research actually has revealed whether that is, what's going on there. And then on the Malawi piece, I was just curious, even anecdotally, is anybody talking about why, from whence this growing willingness to condemn child marriage. You know, there's been much talked about efforts by the chief in Malawi, I'm not sure which communities, like whether you're in her community, breaking up 800 marriages, and the government really taking this on as this like something where people are listening to leaders and saying, yes, which is also not always what we get in policy. Or is it something else, or do we have no idea? Thanks.
If we look at, we don't have a control group, and working with secondary data. And I broke the 12 to 14 from the 15 to 17 because two things. But the most important reasons were there's you can clearly see how the probability of being married increases after age 15. And that has to do with the education system in Mexico. Girls who are 12 to 15 are still in basic education, which has been mandatory for some time. After age 15, they go on to middle school, and that transition is key. Now, what from men's perspective, I can't remember who asked that, but we did not interview men, and I think that's a bit missing in our stuff, actually. But interviews with key persons in that community, and this is also been shown in the transitions to adulthood literature. The key transitions are very different for men than for women. For men, it is leaving the school or getting a job and getting married. For women, those first two transitions are not determined. It's really getting in a union in some cases, especially in rural communities. And that actually links to your 10 to plus difference. I think this difference in achieving a status and becoming an adult is behind that age difference. But we also need to do more research and understanding what makes a man, what makes a man, what makes a woman in terms of transitioning and what they need to be achieving. And also how these unions, how different the unions are internally according to the age difference. I mean, whether men who are only 2 years apart from a 12-year-old bride are very different from those who are 10 more.
Yeah.
And what that implies for men and what that implies for women.
Sure, I can maybe start to answer your question.
Just very briefly though, because we're coming up to the end of the day.
Okay, very briefly. Anecdotally, from our data collection team, what we learned when they started going out to communities to prepare them to map before the data collection even began, they were being introduced to the local community leaders, and they were frequently learning that community leader would tell them with pride that they had just broken up 5 marriages or things like that. So we did see a lot of trickle down from these very public leadership taking a stand against child marriage to the local level, even if breaking up a marriage is not necessarily what we would ideally want. So I think there's definitely evidence that it's coming from that and from that increased awareness in children.
There's also lots of local officials now, child protection officers, it's part of their job to go out and find these marriages, and they're visible, they're there, people know about them. I think there's also a little bit of like a vigilante kind of, like, like within the community, girls, I mean, that's part of this program too, is that girls can go out and kind of, you know, not break up the marriage, but call them out, or I'm not sure exactly what the plan is, but yeah. We should figure that out. Yeah. Thanks.
So I would just like to wrap up with referencing the culture versus social norms question to lead us on out with that. I think that what the social norms conversation is trying to do, it's trying to say culture is important, But culture is this giant steaming stew, and how can we take it and kind of just focus on one really important ingredient and try to understand what it means, how to measure it, and so on. And I think that that's where the interest in social norms is coming from. I think relevant to that, I do think that one of the things, there are a couple of pitfalls in the focus on social norms. I think that there can be a little bit of, you're looking so closely at the nuance of culture that you have run the risk of sort of losing a sense of judgment or a recognition that it's not just about preferences, neutral preferences, it's also about reinforcing systems of hierarchy through social rules and really being able to take that into account. And when we're talking about girls, that is really the case. You have age hierarchies, you have the gender hierarchy, and so on, and really trying to understand how that plays out in social norms. But as our presenters highlighted, there's so many advantages to looking at social norms from a perspective of generating interventions, from explaining the variance in the kinds of in practices that we see, and in explaining the broader context in which girls' lives are shaped and the broader limitations that they face, that it's not just a choice about child marriage, but it's about a whole set of conditioning factors having to do with schooling and their expectations and family support and so on and so on. So a very, very important topic. I want to thank you all very much. I wanted to thank ICRW for hosting us and for co-sponsoring this event with Greenworks. And I wanted to extend a special note of gratitude to Joe Schaffner, who really just coordinated and pulled everything together. Join us for some refreshments and further informal discussion if you can stay on for a few minutes. Thank you.
Interesting.
Is how much the local officials are also able to make bylaws, buying child marriage, and then.
Do you remember?
Yes.